So you were arrested for one count of second-degree murder and one count of possession of a firearm, weapon, or ammunition.
In the case of a missing mystery, the remains of a mother who disappeared more than a decade ago have now been found, and investigators say what led them there came from a man they suspected from the very start.
I don't let nobody ever have to go through what I've been through with my daughter. It's really, really hard.
On a scorching June afternoon in 2014, 24-year-old Trukita Scott left her job for a quick meeting to pick up money for her son. She promised to be right back to get her kids from daycare. She never returned. Hours later, her phone went completely dead, and a frantic search began. What followed was a terrifying 12-year mystery involving a calculated predator, a trail of destroyed families, and a horrifying discovery buried deep in an abandoned backyard that would shock the entire nation. Today, we are visiting the case of Trukita Scott, a young mother whose family spent more than a decade refusing to give up hope, fighting against the fading memory of a system that almost let her killer walk free forever. Before we uncover the disturbing details of how 3 women's lives were tragically linked by the exact same man, take a second to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By staying tuned to these stories, you help ensure that victims like Trukita are never forgotten, and that the search for the truth never stops. To understand the nightmare that unfolded on June 25, 2014, we have to look at who Trukita was. She was a vibrant, ambitious 24-year-old mother living in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She raised her young son and daughter while balancing 2 jobs. She worked hard at a local U-Haul store and spent her remaining hours working as a dedicated caregiver for people with mental health disabilities. Trukita was not just surviving. She was actively building a bright future. She was deeply in love and engaged to her fiancé, Al Livingston. Together, they were planning a wedding and a lifelong partnership. Trukita also held a massive dream. She wanted to become a police officer. She wanted to protect the very community where she grew up. She took this goal seriously. She studied hard, passed the difficult police academy entrance exam, and even participated in a local ride-along to experience the job firsthand. By the summer of 2014, every piece of her life was falling into place. She had stability, a loving partner, beautiful children, and a noble career on the horizon. But lingering in the background of this bright future was a dark, volatile shadow from her past that she could not completely escape. Years earlier, while she was still a teenager in high school, Trukita began an on-and-off relationship with a man named Carl Watts Jr. The couple eventually had a son together. However, what should have been a partnership turned into a living nightmare. According to Trukita's family and friends, the relationship was incredibly turbulent and defined by Carl's severe, controlling, and abusive behavior. Carl could not handle Trukita's independence, and his rage frequently spilled over into her public and professional life. The abuse was not hidden behind closed doors. Trukita's manager at the U-Haul store witnessed the terror firsthand. On multiple occasions, Carl marched into the business and started loud, aggressive arguments with Trukita right in front of paying customers. The manager recalled terrifying moments where Carl became physically aggressive, grabbing Trukita tightly by the arm and trying to drag her outside against her will. The situation escalated to a point where the manager had to step in. He personally confronted Carl, contacted the local police, and ultimately had to file a restraining order against Carl just to keep him away from the business property. By 2014, Trukita had finally found the strength to end the romantic relationship for good. She moved on, got engaged to Al, and tried to build a wall between herself and her abuser. But because they shared a young son, completely cutting ties was impossible. Carl used their child as a permanent tether to keep tabs on her. Friends and family noted that Carl never accepted the breakup. He resented her happiness, he resented her new fiancé, and he deeply loathed the fact that he no longer controlled her life. He stayed in her orbit, waiting for an opportunity to assert his dominance once again. June 25, 2014, began as a normal, busy day. Trukita spent the morning running errands with her mother before heading out to work her shift at the U-Haul store. But throughout the morning, a disturbing pattern began. Trukita's cell phone rang repeatedly. Her mother watched as Trukita looked at the screen and deliberately declined call after call. Her mother knew exactly who was on the other end of those persistent rings. Carl Watts Jr. The constant, aggressive calling took an immediate physical and emotional toll on Trukita. Her mother recalled that Trukita suddenly complained of a severe headache and expressed a deep, exhaustion-driven desire to just go home and rest. But Trukita was responsible, so she pushed through the stress and went to work. She arrived at the U-Haul facility and worked her shift until approximately 2 p.m. What happened immediately after she clocked out remains one of the most agonizing gaps in the entire timeline. Investigators later learned that Trukita had reluctantly agreed to meet Carl that afternoon. The purpose of the meeting was simple and routine. She was supposed to collect child support money from him for their son. This was a classic manipulation tactic often used by abusers to force an estranged partner into an isolated meeting. Throughout the afternoon, Trukita stayed in constant contact with her fiancé, Al Livingston. They exchanged casual, loving text messages back and forth, as they usually did. At around 4:30 p.m., Al sent her a text message telling her how much he loved her. Trukita quickly replied, "I love you too." It was a completely normal, affectionate exchange. But that text message at 4:30 p.m. would become the final known communication anyone would ever receive from Trukita Scott. Immediately after sending it, her phone was abruptly powered off. She completely vanished into thin air. The first major alarm bell rang late that afternoon at the children's daycare center. Trukita was fiercely protective of her kids and never, under any circumstances, ran late without calling. As the closing hour approached, the daycare workers looked out at an empty parking lot. Trukita's son and daughter were left waiting. Worried, the daycare staff called Al Livingston, informing him that the children had never been picked up. Al felt an immediate wave of worry, but he tried to calm himself down. He rationalized the situation, thinking that maybe Trukita had gone home after her shift, fallen into a deep sleep because of her headache, and simply lost track of time. He drove to the daycare, picked up the kids, and headed straight home. He expected to see her car in the driveway and find her resting inside. When Al walked through the front door, the house was entirely normal. Nothing was broken, nothing was out of place, and no signs of a struggle existed. But Trukita was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. Al knew that leaving her children stranded at a daycare was something Trukita would never do. Even if she had to leave the area unexpectedly, she would have taken her children with her or called someone to secure them. Al immediately contacted Trukita's mother, and the entire family plunged into terror. Trukita's mother called her daughter's phone over and over again in a desperate loop. By her own count, she dialed the number 23 times in a row, and every single call went straight to a cold, automated voicemail. The family did not need to wait for a police timeline to know what had happened. They knew about the history of physical abuse. They knew about the controlling behavior at the U-Haul store. And they knew Trukita had planned to meet Carl that very afternoon to get the child support money. Trukita's mother began sending frantic messages to other relatives, stating openly that she believed Carl had abducted her daughter. It was an immediate maternal instinct, built on years of watching a predator stalk her child. The family immediately contacted the police department to file a missing person and potential abduction report. They also took matters into their own hands and called Carl Watts Jr. directly. When they got him on the phone, Carl's demeanor was chillingly calm. He casually acknowledged that Trukita had indeed come to see him earlier that afternoon to collect the money for their son. However, he smoothly insisted that she had left right after getting the cash, and he claimed he had absolutely no idea where she went or why she was missing. Trukita's loved ones did not believe a single word. They pressed him for details, asking where exactly they met, what time she left, and what direction she drove. Carl refused to expand on his story. He grew defensive, refused to answer any more questions, and abruptly hung up the phone. Immediately after that tense conversation, Carl did something that solidified the family's darkest suspicions. He vanished completely. He cut off all contact. He never called back to check if the mother of his child had been found. He never reached out to see if his own son was okay. He skipped town, abandoned his child, and dropped entirely out of sight. Because Carl was already facing an active, unrelated arrest warrant for a different matter, his sudden disappearance officially turned him into a fugitive from justice. For one grueling week, Trukita's family lived in a state of absolute suspension, plastering the city with flyers and begging local news outlets for coverage. Then came the first major piece of physical evidence. Investigators located Trukita's vehicle. But the location of the car did not bring hope. It brought profound dread. The car was found abandoned in Miami's Liberty City neighborhood. This was a staggering 24 miles away from her home in Fort Lauderdale and far outside the radius of her daily routine. The police department released very few details to the public or the family about the state of the vehicle, refusing to explain exactly how they located it or whether there were signs of foul play inside. The physical distance between her home and the recovery site made one thing certain. Trukita had not driven that car there voluntarily. On the exact same day the vehicle was recovered, the police released a snippet of surveillance footage to the media. The video captured Trukita running errands around the time she left her job at U-Haul on the afternoon of June 25th. The footage showed her moving normally, completely unaware of the trap waiting for her. These silent, grainy frames would stand as the absolute last known images of Trukita Scott alive. 4 days after the car was discovered, the pressure on Carl Watts Jr. became too intense. Knowing he was a wanted fugitive with his face broadcast across local television stations, Carl walked into a police station and turned himself in. Trukita's family felt a brief moment of hope, believing the man who held the key to the mystery was finally behind bars. But that hope was quickly crushed by the strict requirements of criminal law. Investigators took Carl into an interrogation room and grilled him for hours about Trukita's whereabouts. Carl did not break. He maintained a cold, detached demeanor and repeatedly denied having anything to do with her disappearance. Because the police had only an abandoned car and no physical body, no forensic crime scene, and no direct eyewitnesses to an abduction, they did not have enough evidence to charge him with a crime relating to Trukita. He was held on his unrelated outstanding federal charges. But as far as Trukita's case was concerned, the legal system was completely stuck. The family's frustration was overwhelming. The man they knew killed Trukita was sitting in a jail cell, yet he was completely insulated by the lack of physical evidence. The timeline was filled with haunting, unanswerable questions that kept Al and Trukita's mother awake night after night. Where did Trukita go after leaving Carl that afternoon? If she had somehow walked away voluntarily, why was her phone turned off immediately after a loving text to her fiancé? And if Carl was innocent, why did he leave his phone on the following day? This brought about a strange twist in the early days of the investigation. Trukita's family revealed that her cell phone, which had been abruptly powered off at 4:30 p.m. on the day she disappeared, was suddenly turned back on the very next day. For a brief, agonizing window, the family and tech investigators tracked activity from the device. The phone began pinging cell towers at various scattered locations throughout South Florida. For a moment, the family thought this electronic trail would lead them straight to Trukita's location. But the pings were erratic, moving rapidly across the region, suggesting that someone else was driving around with her phone or clearing out her personal belongings. Before investigators could pin down a precise location, the phone went dark permanently. The electronic pings led to a total dead end. As the months dragged on without a body or a confession, Trukita's case began to freeze over. The initial media storm died down, and public attention started to fade. But behind the scenes, a terrifying realization began to dawn on investigators and the public. Trukita's family discovered they were not the only grieving relatives who had pointed their fingers directly at Carl Watts Jr. Years before Trukita ever met him, another South Florida family had been destroyed by the exact same man. The story takes a deep dive into the history of a woman named Vicki Simmons. Vicki was born and raised in Miami, a graduate of Booker T. Washington High School. Her sister, LaShawn, described her as a reserved, quiet, and deeply loved mother of two who possessed an incredible passion for dancing and real estate. At some point in her young adult life, Vicki crossed paths with Carl Watts Jr. From the absolute beginning, LaShawn felt a profound sense of unease around Carl. She could not put her finger on a specific action, but an instinctive alarm bell rang whenever he was near her sister. LaShawn's instincts proved tragically correct. Vicki's relationship with Carl rapidly descended into the exact same pattern that Trukita would experience years later. A toxic, on-again, off-again cycle driven by Carl's intense jealousy and need for control. The tension exploded when Vicki began working as an exotic dancer to support her children. Carl completely disapproved, and their arguments became frequent and terrifyingly hostile. Eventually, just like Trukita, Vicki reached her limit. Tired of the constant fear, the control, and the instability, she told Carl she was leaving him for good. Her family believes that definitive decision cost her her life. On February 17, 2009, Vicki Simmons disappeared. 2 days later, her body was discovered inside a local hotel room along Biscayne Bay Boulevard in Miami. The police kept the specific details of her cause of death hidden from the public to protect the integrity of the active case. However, a lead detective flatly told Vicki's family that Carl Watts Jr. was their primary suspect. He had been seen in the area, he had a clear motive of rejection, and his history of domestic violence was well documented. But just like in Trukita's case, the legal system hit a wall. Investigators simply did not have the concrete forensic link or the eyewitness testimony needed to secure a murder indictment. The case grew cold. No arrest was made, and Carl Watts Jr. walked away from a murder scene completely free. He was allowed to re-enter society, navigate the streets of South Florida, and actively seek out his next victim. That next victim was Trukita Scott. The revelation of Vicki Simmons' death sent a shockwave of terror through Trukita's family. They realized they were dealing with a calculated serial predator who knew exactly how to exploit the high evidentiary standards of the legal system to avoid justice. Local media also began digging into Carl's records and unearthed a horrifying detail from just 1 month before Trukita vanished. In May 2014, Carl had been arrested after surveillance cameras caught him trying to forcefully kidnap an 18-year-old girl from a public bus stop. He faced multiple kidnapping-related charges throughout his adult life and was widely known to local law enforcement as an extremely dangerous hunter of women. Yet, because he had been released on bond for that May incident, he was free to meet Trukita in June. While the evidence piled up in the court of public opinion, Carl's own mother publicly defended him to local news stations like NBC6. She claimed her son was innocent until proven guilty and stated that while she did not know where he was hiding during his brief run as a fugitive, she would encourage him to clear his name. She even went as far as to express worry that something bad might have happened to him. This public defense was a slap in the face to Trukita's mother, who was entering a dark tunnel of prolonged grief. By June 2015, a full year had passed since Trukita vanished from the U-Haul parking lot. Her family was completely trapped in a painful limbo. They spent every single day chasing down unverified tips, calling investigators, and trying desperately to keep a spotlight on a case the world wanted to forget. Trukita's mother gave a heartbreaking interview to the Sun-Sentinel, detailing the unique agony of waking up every morning not knowing where her daughter's body lay. She described the exhaustion of watching her grandchildren grow up without a mother, knowing the man who stole her was sitting in a prison cell on unrelated charges, refusing to say a single word. Whenever reporters reached out to the Fort Lauderdale Police Department, they received the same generic response. The case was technically active, but there were no new developments, no new leads, and no new hope. After 2015, the media completely stopped covering the case. Trukita Scott became just another name on a missing persons database, kept alive only by online true crime communities and the unyielding love of her family. Meanwhile, Carl Watts Jr. was quietly serving out time for his federal offenses, biding his time until he could get back out. The timeline shows that upon his eventual release, he immediately fell back into his deadly pattern. He met a young mother named Shandell Harris. Shandell was an incredibly resilient woman from Miami who had overcome massive hurdles. She became a mother at the young age of 17, which forced her to leave high school. Determined to build a life for her daughter, she made the agonizing sacrifice to temporarily send her child to live with her father in Miami, while Shandell moved hundreds of miles away to participate in the Turner Job Corps Center in Albany, Georgia. She worked tirelessly, earned her GED, and planned to attend technical college. Eventually, life brought her back to South Florida, where she met Carl. At first, Carl put on his familiar mask. Friends described him as charming, attentive, and incredibly loving. Shandell fell hard, and after dating for 2 years, they were married. But almost immediately after the wedding, the mask slipped. Shandell discovered that Carl's maintaining relationships with multiple other women. The disappointment quickly curdled into terror as Carl's controlling nature asserted itself. Shandell realized she had married a monster and made the brave decision to pack her things and leave. She had no idea she was stepping into the exact same trap that killed Vicki Simmons and Trukita Scott. The breaking point arrived on April 1st, 2022. Shandell found a series of explicit messages on Carl's phone, confirming his ongoing affairs. A heated, terrifying argument erupted inside their home and raged throughout the night. By 7 a.m. the following morning, Shandell stood her ground and told Carl directly that she wanted a divorce. Carl's response was instantaneous, explosive violence. He struck Shandell in the face with a closed fist, knocking her down. He became completely erratic, screaming that he could not live without her. He ran into the kitchen, grabbed a large knife, and brutally attacked her, inflicting deep wounds to her arm, her hand, and her thigh. As Shandell lay bleeding, Carl pulled out a handgun, pressed the barrel against his own temple, and threatened to pull the trigger if she dared to leave the room. Trapped in a literal bloodbath, Shandell had to use her wits to survive. She forced herself to calm down, looked into the eyes of her attacker, and lied, telling him she loved him and would stay if he just put the weapons away. The moment Carl lowered the gun, his behavior shifted into a deeply disturbing phase of damage control. He cleaned Shandell's wounds and immediately began using bleach to scrub her blood from the floors and walls. He told her he refused to go back to jail and ordered her to gather her bloody clothes so they could be completely destroyed. Later that day, believing he had successfully terrorized her into compliance, Carl drove her to a local store to buy medical supplies. While out, Shandell found a split second to secretly contact her mother and relay a coded plea for help. She convinced Carl to drive her to her mother's residence. The moment the car pulled into the driveway, Shandell threw the door open, rushed inside the house, and screamed at her mother to lock the deadbolts and call 911. Carl ran up to the house and began pounding furiously on the door, demanding she come outside. Her mother stood firm and refused to open it. Even after police officers initially responded and left, Carl circled back to the house, terrorizing the family until he finally fled the area. Shandell was rushed to the hospital, where she gave a comprehensive, detailed statement to domestic violence detectives. She believed she was finally safe. She was wrong. 2 days later, on April 3rd, 2022, Shandell, her mother, and her 11-year-old daughter drove to a local community pool for the child's routine swimming lesson. Carl knew the family's schedule perfectly. As they sat near the water, Shandell's mother spotted Carl walking aggressively toward them across the pool deck. She grabbed Shandell's hand in terror. Carl walked right up to them, holding a thick stack of cash. In a low, transactional voice, he repeatedly asked Shandell how much money it would take to make the domestic violence charges go away. Shandell refused. Realizing he could no longer buy or beat her into submission, Carl pulled out a hidden firearm. In broad daylight, in front of dozens of terrified families and young children, and directly looking at Shandell's mother and 11-year-old daughter, Carl opened fire. He shot Shandell multiple times without a shred of hesitation. Shandell collapsed onto the concrete and died right there at the scene. This time, there were dozens of eyewitnesses. Carl Watts Jr. was tackled and arrested immediately, charged with first-degree murder. When the news of Shandell's public execution hit the television screens, the families of Trukita Scott and Vicki Simmons were completely paralyzed. They felt a horrific mix of validation and profound grief. They had spent years telling anyone who would listen that Carl was a cold-blooded killer. And now a third innocent mother was dead because the system had failed to hold him accountable decades earlier. But for the first time in 12 years, Carl was not getting out on bond. He was locked away securely in a maximum security facility. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but Carl eventually realized he had no escape from the mountain of eyewitness testimony in Shandell's murder. He accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to the murder of Shandell Harris, and was sentenced to 45 years in state prison. But for Trukita's family, 45 years was not enough. They still did not know where their daughter was. They still did not have a grave to visit. They pushed investigators to use Carl's permanent imprisonment as leverage to finally get the truth. Then, in May 2026, nearly 12 years after Trukita Scott vanished from the U-Haul parking lot, the ultimate breakthrough occurred. Facing a lifetime behind bars and stripped of his power over women, Carl Watts Jr. finally broke his long silence. He confessed to the murder of Trukita Scott and gave detectives the exact coordinates of her final resting place. On May 12, 2026, a convoy of police cruisers and forensic excavators pulled up to an overgrown, abandoned property in Miami's Little Haiti neighborhood. Investigators walked into the backyard, cordoned off the area, and began digging into the earth. Hours later, they unearthed human remains. The family waited in agonizing suspense for 1 week as forensic pathologists analyzed the teeth. On May 19, 2026, dental records provided an absolute match. The remains belonged to Trukita Scott. After 4,339 days of searching, wondering, and crying in the dark, Trukita's family finally knew exactly where she was.
You know, it's not going to give us 100% closure, but now we know what happened.
The discovery of Trukita's remains brings a devastating end to a 12-year missing person chapter. But the story is far from over. As of this moment, Carl Watts Jr. has not been formally charged with Trukita's murder, and the details of how she died remain a closely guarded police secret. Furthermore, the family of Vicki Simmons is still waiting in the dark, 17 years later, hoping that Carl will finally confess to the hotel room murder that started this entire timeline of horror. Trukita Scott was a young woman who did everything right. She left her abuser, found true love, worked 2 jobs, and tried to become a police officer to make the world a safer place. Her life was cut short by a system that routinely underestimates the lethal danger of domestic abusers and allows predators to roam free until it is far too late. As we close this chapter on Trukita's story, we must reflect on a heavy question. How can our legal system better protect victims of domestic violence before their names become headlines in a true crime documentary? How many warning signs do we need to see before an abuser is taken off the streets for good? Let's honor the memories of Trukita Scott, Vicki Simmons, and Shandell Harris by keeping their stories alive and demanding absolute accountability. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a real discussion about how we can prevent these tragedies from happening to another family. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.